Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar. This is another webinar in a series of webinars being presented by the U.S. Forest Service and the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We have a great program this afternoon. Dr. Dan Isaac is going to be talking about big databases and data mining. Before we get started with the webinar, however, I'd like to cover a few basic housekeeping rules. First and foremost, we are going to be muting all of the lines once we finish the introductions of the speaker. My colleague Monica Thomasy from the Forest Service will officially welcome you on behalf of the Forest Service, and then before we turn it over to Dan for the presentation, we will be muting all the lines and just bringing up Dan's line so that we don't have extraneous noises. Because we are muting the lines, if you have a question, there is a chat box in the lower left-hand corner of the screen that you'll see, and I will be typing comments there. You hopefully see some comments already about dialing in, but you are welcome to type your questions there for the speaker and bring them up, and as we have time at the end, I will read through those questions and offer the speaker an opportunity to respond to them. So please type any questions you have in the chat box, lower left-hand corner of your screen. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and the association is going to make these recordings available on its website. If you have a strong interest in receiving this recording, please contact Monica Thomasy at the Forest Service or myself, Jonathan Maudsley, at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. We can make that available to you fairly soon after the webinar is completed. So thank you very much again for your participation in this afternoon's webinar. It's a delight to have you, and we're really looking forward to today's presentation. Before the presenter, however, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Monica Thomasy at the Forest Service to provide a little bit of introduction on behalf of the Forest Service, welcome you on behalf of the Forest Service, and also introduce today's speaker. Monica.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for this opportunity once again to connect biologists and managers with some more of the work we do in the Forest Service Wildlife and Fisheries Research Programs for wildlife and fish managers across the country. Welcome, everyone. Through this AFWA webinar series, we're able to address many questions the state and other biologists have about scientific information on topics of current concern and who is doing which kinds of research and delivery efforts. Today's topic was requested due to the increasing discussions that stakeholders and agencies have had on data management, and particularly for aquatic ecosystems. So in response, we're demonstrating data management for aquatic species conservation.
It's a short question, I guess.
Modern ideas for data management. Dan Isaac is a research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service in Boise, Idaho, where he works on aquatic species conservation and management issues across the western United States. Dan holds a PhD from the University of Wyoming and has 20 years of experience in aquatic research. His current research focuses on understanding the effects of climate change, environmental gradients, and natural disasters on stream habitats and communities, stream temperature, water quality, and species distribution monitoring and modeling, development and application of spatial statistical models for stream networks, and the use of digital and social media to connect people, information, and landscapes. And last year, he was honored with the Climate Adaptation Leadership Award from the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plant Climate Adaptation Strategy Joint Implementation Working Group for his development of state-of-the-art decision support tools to facilitate climate change vulnerability assessments and more efficient monitoring systems in forest streams. With that, take it away, Dan. Thank you.
All right, we're going to mute the lines now.
The conference has been muted.
And then bring back Dan. Dan, are you there?
I am.
Great. Take it away.
Okay, looks like we're ready. Well, thank you so much, John, for inviting me here today, and Monica for the nice introduction, and AFWA for the interest in this topic that I think has a lot of value across both terrestrial and aquatic systems. And the idea here is that oftentimes we collectively across agencies have developed a lot of data sets. And those data sets can be combined now into interagency databases and then linked up with new technologies that allow it to be possible to develop better information at broad scales and high spatial resolution that can then be used to help in decision making, as well as giving us status and trend assessments for the natural resources that we're trying ultimately to manage and conserve. Next slide, please. And just as a little bit of background, kind of the environment that really drove us to adopt some of these new technologies that are now available and to try to work towards developing functional databases out of a disparate set of data sets was just the broad geography of the Western United States. So the research station that I work for is the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and the service area that in theory we're supposed to provide managers on the National Forest System with information to help them manage aquatic resources is outlined by that heavy black line that you see there. And so there's something like 80 national forests that encompasses an area that's larger than the state of Alaska. And there's a very small number of aquatic researchers within our research station to try to achieve that mission. So it was always kind of a running joke that, yeah, who in their right mind could actually, serve our mission that we're tasked with in terms of providing information at that scale. The other thing that we have in the Western United States is kind of this patchwork quilt of jurisdictions, different federal agencies, different state agencies, and so there's always kind of this mosaic of people that are trying to manage and conserve resources and are confronting, a similar set of issues with regards to climate change, urbanization, global change, et cetera. And so ultimately we needed to have strategically consistent information across broad scales to address our research mission to the National Forest, but also to help these other groups that are also working on lands that are directly adjacent to Forest Service lands. Next slide, please. At the same time, we need to have tactically precise information, because most of the things that we do to try to improve the habitat conditions for a particular species are done at a local scale. And so we need to be able to see the individual trees within that broader forest across a broad geographic area, so we can think tactically about what is the smartest place to invest our limited conservation dollars to achieve the biggest bang for our buck. Next slide, please. And kind of icing on the cake here then is that we've all dealing with this ongoing issue of budgets that are either flat or gradually shrinking over time, while the resources that we're trying to manage and conserve are being put under increasing pressure. And so there's this drive to need to be able to do more with less, just to stay in place where we are now in terms of managing and conserving things. Next slide, please. And that then is where technology really can be a powerful force multiplier, because it can allow us to do huge tasks with big data sets using a new generation of technologies that quite simply weren't available even 5 years ago. But now when we look at the quality and quantity of information that we can get from remote sensing, nationally consistent digital elevation models, and other geospatial tools for streams and terrestrial systems, coupled with miniature sensors and new fields of geostatistics, we can start to do things at broad scales and fine resolutions with these sorts of tools. And then also just the raw computing power that we have at our fingertips now is an order of magnitude greater than it was not too long ago. Next slide, please. And then on the back end of that, once we start to develop these big data sets and we can get useful information from them, it's a lot easier now through social and digital media to broadcast that information so that it gets put in front of everyone that might consider it to be relevant. And so kind of the traditional research model in terms of information dissemination has focused on peer-reviewed manuscripts, and then sometimes we would do a workshop. Now we can transmit information virtually instantaneously and across the globe, literally, by using things like blogs, websites, digital media. And we can also have that information tied to real-world coordinates so that the science is literally painted on the landscape. And for a land management agency like the Forest Service or BLM or state agencies that have to make geographically specific decisions, you need to have all this information tied to a GIS platform so that you can tie it back to those local coordinates. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that we've got going for us is that even though that there's been a whole range of ways that people have collected data in the past, and we've got different monitoring programs now across all the different agencies, we've also put a lot of work into really standardizing the basic set of protocols that we have for measuring things like fish and wildlife abundance or for temperatures or genetic assays. There can be different protocols, but at the same time we've focused really on making those things good enough that they do provide an accurate measure in most cases of that thing that we're trying to measure at that specific site. Next slide, please. And so as we've applied these protocols in the past to collect these data sets, then they've just kind of grown organically through time. And so these are some of the water quality and fisheries data sets that I'm most familiar with, but I'm sure there's direct analogs in terms of just the raw amount of data that are out there for terrestrial systems as well. And so we've continued to collect these data sets, and because we haven't been as good about at the outset creating databases to house all these data sets, we've literally now generated these mountains of messy data sets that could be combined and built into functional databases that everyone can tap into. Next slide, please. The trick in doing that is that there are a series of steps that you have to go through with these data sets to make them into something that's functional, right? So just having a mass of data in and of itself isn't a functional database. You have to go through a standard set of QA, QC procedures to flag anomalous records and try to get those resolved. You have to have that information then formatted so that it goes into a consistent set of table structures and directories within a database. And then you also need to do the metadata and actually document all the detailed steps that went into processing data and how it's formatted so that other people that weren't involved directly with collecting the data can understand it well enough to be able to use it and understand what the strengths and weaknesses of it are. Next slide, please. The other aspect to this then is, so the previous slide we were looking really at kind of a relational database, and so that's where you might have something like Access or Oracle that stores thousands of records that have a common set of fields and allows you to more efficiently query those. The other type of database then that we need to be concerned with are just the geospatial databases, and so things like ArcGIS or other types of GIS software that allow us to take those records in the relational database and put those into a geographically specific point on the Earth's surface. And so in the case of stream data sets, one of the things that we've lacked for a long time until just the last decade or so has been a consistent geospatial framework for organizing our data sets. And now through the work that EPA and USGS have done to develop the National Hydrography data set, we've got that geospatial framework, and so gives us just a consistent kind of backbone that allows us to link data sets, whatever type they are and wherever they're collected, to an individual stream reach that has a unique identifier anywhere across the country. And so that gives us kind of the spatial complement to those relational databases. Next slide, please. And once we've taken it that far that we've got this information in a database that is set up so that it can be efficiently queried, then we can really start to do a lot of things with it that provide value added over and above the actual data themselves. And so we can use it to refine or design new sampling protocols so that we can most efficiently collect new data to fill in gaps in the existing data sets, or we can use those existing data sets to do a suite of different sorts of analyses, and in some cases then use those, say, with geostatistical models to give us spatially continuous maps of that particular resource. And once you can do that, then just remapping that resource at a different point in time gives you the possibility of doing trend assessments at broad scales and fine resolution using these big data sets. Next slide, please. One of the challenges to creating the big databases, though, is that it is literally a full-time job, and it takes a certain amount of technical proficiency to create these things. And that right now is kind of what I see as being one of the biggest gaps that we have in terms of being able to tap into the potential of these existing data sets. Because we just, given kind of the legacy of Fish and Game agencies and Forest Service, we've been more interested in collecting data than we have been in curating it. And curating it properly does require, a whole different set of, database skills and technical skills to make all that information work together. Next slide, please. The other thing then that getting information out of these databases requires is kind of more of a team science approach. So typically they get to be large enough and complex enough that no one person has the full set of skills that they would need to go in, pull out the information or the data, create a model from it, and then map it geospatially. And so you need to have kind of a team of experts that all are really good at what they do, working together to develop information from these big data sets. Next slide, please. And where we get those experts then can kind of vary. In some instances, we can hire people with information technology skills that come right out of the tech sector, not a traditional field for Fish and Wildlife agencies to be hiring people, but those would be the sorts of folks that have skills directly from day one to do some of these things. The other thing we can do is just be training the people that we have in-house that like to do things with databases or geostatistical analyses, encouraging them to continue learning about those things and kind of become our local in-house experts. And that really is kind of the model that we've taken in the lab that I'm in Boise, is that just kind of by luck we had a few people that like to do databases, to do GIS, et cetera, and we just kind of focused on continuing to learn and get them exposed to new skills so they could develop those. And then those specialized skills over time kind of grew and ultimately became their whole job, so that they function now as part of that specialized science data team through these skills that they've gathered organically during the course of their career. Next slide, please. And so that's kind of the general background, and it's all kind of abstract and sounds great, but would be a challenging thing to actually do. And so I do want to highlight a few examples of how we've pulled some of these things off and the value now that we're seeing from doing the work, the time and work it took to develop these skills, and these databases are starting to do a lot of things for a lot of different agencies in the Western United States. So one of the big things that we've been concerned about, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where we've got salmon runs and other ESA-listed species like bull trout that cover a broad geographic area and cause regulatory issues in terms of ESA consultations in many places, has been to really start pulling together some of those data sets that might allow us to better address how and where we're going to invest for some of those species going forward. And in the Northwest, we've literally spent billions of dollars trying to conserve and manage some of these species. And now there are concerns stemming from climate change that some of those investments may be at risk. Next slide, please. So one of the big things that we were lacking 5 years ago that was just an obvious void in terms of trying to understand how climate change might affect salmon and trout species in the Western United States was just more accurate climate scenarios. So we had kind of the global climate models that are run for basically terrestrial systems at a really coarse grid cell size. And we had local information, but we didn't have anything kind of intermediate that would allow us to downscale the outputs from the climate models to something that was relevant to a particular species of fish in a particular reach of stream. And so the place that we really focused on addressing that was to develop these river network landscape scale models for both stream temperature and flow, such that it just created another link in the chain that allowed us to do that downscaling to a scale then that's relevant to a manager in the field trying to make decisions about how to best invest for that particular species in a stream that they know about. Next slide, please. And the first step in that process then was to simply pull together all the stream temperature data that existed within the Western United States. And the technology to collect these type of data, basically was miniaturized a couple decades ago, and so people have been collecting an enormous amount of this sort of microclimate data in the Western U.S. and other parts of the U.S. as well for decades. And so there was a huge amount of data out there. People kind of knew there was a lot around, but nobody had a firm grasp on exactly how extensive these data sets would be. But that was the first step, is just going through the process of getting it all aggregated into one place so that we could get a grasp of what was out there. And in the case of the Western United States, more than 100 different state, federal, tribal, private organizations collect this sort of data. Turns out there were more than 20,000 unique stream and river sites where someone from an agency had put a temperature sensor at one point in time. And there's literally more than 200 million hourly temperature records. Just to collect that amount of data from scratch would cost something like $10 million by the time you buy the equipment and then hire technicians to go out and collect in the field. And these data then were basically pulled together and made into a functional database for a small fraction of that cost that now all of those 100 agencies can tap into and use. Next slide, please. Once the data are organized and built into a database, then we can use those with geospatial technologies and predictor variables that we can derive from nationally available geospatial data sets in GIS software. And these allow us then to predict very accurately what stream temperatures have been across the Western United States and across a lot of different climate years. So that graph in the bottom right is basically the performance we get out of linking these big data sets to these geospatial predictor variables. And next slide, please. Once that linkage is built and you've got a model then that translates what those mathematical relationships are to real-world coordinates in a GIS, that allows us to basically map out what those interpolated stream temperature scenarios are. And so we've got a consistent set of those now where we're just in the process of finishing Arizona, and at that point we'll have completed the entire Western United States, where we've got a very high-resolution climate map that's consistent across all streams and rivers. Next slide, please. And just to give kind of a sense of how this happened, it has been a lot of work, but it's something where literally any journey starts with a first step on that journey. And the first place we figured out how to do this was one river basin in central Idaho. Once we'd figured out the technological steps that it took to organize these data sets and fit an accurate model to them using these nationally available geospatial layers, it was just a matter then of scaling that basic approach up for that first river basin to larger and larger areas. And so once we got the technology out of the way, then it was just selling that, and everyone could see that would provide a lot of value. And so we could go to the Great Northern LCC initially. They funded it. As soon as we got to that scale, then these other groups literally approached us rather than we having to approach them and said, we would like to have that information here too. So can you work in other parts of the West? And it just kind of grew organically from that point. Next slide, please. And on the back end of this, then once the database has been created, the scenarios have been created, to really foster these user communities and make sure that the information is flowing freely among all the different agencies that have contributed to it or that want to use the information, then it's nice to be able to design a custom website to just provide that information so that it's out there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so we've also then figured out how to create these websites. That's not a hard thing to do in this day and age. Many agencies have people with these basic sorts of skills. And this allows us then just to distribute the climate scenarios in user-friendly digital formats, as well as the raw data themselves, so that if people want to build their own models or do other things with it, they have access to the raw measurements. And because we've developed this from an existing user community that had collected a lot of this data already, we've got a built-in user community. And so we get a lot of traffic through the website coming to it to download digital data products. Next slide, please. And that database, now that it's built, drives a whole suite of additional applications, some of which we didn't originally envision that people would be using it for, but it makes a lot of sense once the information's out there. And so the scenarios allow us to create better information about species distributions in terms of what is thermally suitable, what's not thermally suitable. People that want to create their own temperature models just can go grab data here. And then one of the other big benefits we've seen is now that everyone has this shared database, there's a lot of just kind of self-organization that goes on in terms of doing new monitoring. And so people from all these different agencies can look to see whether or not that particular site on a stream has data already. And if it does, then there's no point in going there to collect more of it. And they can just kind of go around and fill the gaps without us having to do any formal sort of broad, grand scale organization to this. Next slide, please. And the temperature scenarios and the temperature database then really just provided the foundation that we could build on with some other large data sets. And so, in the case of species presence-absence data, there's a huge amount of that sort of data that are out there. That fish data set that I'm highlighting in the bottom right there is just a compilation of information from Idaho Fish and Game, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and Wyoming Game and Fish, as well as some Forest Service data. And there are literally tens of thousands of sites where people have gone out and done surveys, either via electrofishing or snorkeling, to determine presence, absence, and in some cases abundance of different fish species. We can link those data sets now to these high-resolution climate scenarios to start describing what the environmental niches are for these different species, and this was a paper that we just published recently highlighting that. Next slide, please. And we can build further on that. So if we want to understand not just temperature constraints on species, but also other environmental things that constrain their distributions, we can again go back to some of the geospatial data sets that are available nationally and pull in things like habitat size, habitat condition, et cetera, and build models that are slightly more complex, but allow us to still accurately predict the distribution and abundance of, in this case, two different native trout species that we're concerned about, bull trout and cutthroat trout. And once we've got those models built, we can then use them to map back onto the stream network across the entire range of a species at high resolution, the probability that that species would occur there under different climate scenarios. Next slide, please. And so this is what the map of the potential distribution looks like for bull trout across all the streams within the U.S. portion of their range in the northwestern United States. Turns out that there are about 5,000 potential habitats where they could occur, but there's only about 350 of those that have a really high probability of being high-quality habitat. And so now that we can do this in terms of mapping out what conditions are in the current climatic scenario, we can also then enumerate, exactly where they are, and basically build maps that allow us to look at that data set a lot of different ways. And because it's tied to the climate scenarios that are also built with big temperature data sets in the Norwest Project, we can then highlight or show how that map might change under different future warming conditions. Next slide, please. And so 2080s, a rather large temperature change between now and the end of the century, and this particular species, bull trout, has a very cold climate niche, and so we would expect that its distribution is going to contract, and the models will show that. Next slide, please. But one of the things that people had thought for a long time about this particular species was that it was kind of the walking dead in terms of being a species that was likely to go extinct from climate change because it has such a cold thermal niche. We can show through these big data sets and these accurate models that even under a very extreme climate scenario, climate warming scenario, this species isn't going to go extinct. Moreover, we can highlight within the range of that species what the specific streams and watersheds are where it's most likely that it's going to persist in the future, and we can give that information then to managers within those landscapes so that they understand that they've got a very special stream and population of bull trout in their backyard. And that then gives them the flexibility to think about, if we're going to do things on the landscape in terms of timber harvest or building roads or habitat restoration, how do you direct maybe some of those activities away from these special places and maybe direct more conservation resources to them. Next slide, please. And then again, the information has to be packaged in a format that makes it user-friendly so that people can actually use the science in their own backyard, and that is where we just build the website that provides the information in a variety of user-friendly digital maps, as well as the fish data sets that went into building the models themselves. Next slide, please. And what we found by kind of going through this process of pulling together these big interagency databases, building accurate models from them, and then packaging that information in formats that make it easy for people to use the science, is that really does empower local decision makers. They can see now the broader context around those individual streams or habitats that they might be working with, and they can see that within the context of the landscape that they know well, but also across the entirety of the species range. So that facilitates them being able to better plan, as well as the agencies that are typically having to take a more strategic view across large areas, allows them to plan better as well. Next slide, please. And then again, no point in belaboring this, but I think websites, in terms of being able to deliver that information, and these databases, once they're developed, are just absolutely crucial. That allows you to really engage everyone that's interested in these particular topics to use the information, as well as providing feedback to the researchers and the technical teams that are trying to improve the availability and the quality of information that comes from these data sets. Next slide, please. And so we've kind of gone through that process, and this doesn't happen overnight. Obviously, it's taken us probably 6 or 7 years of work that I've highlighted in terms of building the temperature data set originally, and then some of the fish data sets that came after that to allow us to kind of complete this cycle. But now that we've gone through the process once, it's relatively straightforward to replicate it again and just modify it to address new sorts of needs in the future. And that's where now I think we're really going to start to be efficient going forward in terms of creating this information cycle loop. Next slide, please. And what we're doing next then is focusing on the revolution that environmental DNA sampling is leading within aquatic systems. It's possible now to go out, collect a water sample from a stream, a river, or a lake, pull the DNA out of that sample, and you get good information about what species live at that particular site, and in some cases you can get good information about the abundance of those species at a site. And so we've paired the work that we do in our lab in Boise with the new lab that the Forest Service has, the National Genomic Center for Wildlife and Fisheries Conservation, that's run out of Missoula. And basically, we're just linking up our labs so that we can provide the sort of database and geospatial aspects to the genomic sorts of things that they're now doing with eDNA. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, every time someone collects one of these samples now, they're getting it information about not just the target species. So there's a lot of interest, say, in doing this for bull trout, but every time that sample is collected, it also provides information about all the non-game species that are out there, and it also presents something that is easily preserved in the lab, so we can actually develop a kind of a biodiversity archive from these rapid eDNA samples. Next slide, please. And collecting this sort of information now is it's basically got a really solid protocol behind it, and as long as the markers designed for particular species are robust, then it's very sensitive, precise, and is not very inclined to giving false positives or false absences. You get really good information from this. And the nice thing, too, is that it's not especially labor intensive, and it doesn't take a lot of equipment in the field. And so one person can carry all the information they need in a day pack, and they can literally sample as many places as they can get to in a day. And this map is just showing a watershed within northern Idaho where we had very little information about the distribution of bull trout. But over the course of a few weeks, that person sampled a few hundred sites, and we get very accurate maps then showing what the occurrence of bull trout was in that particular watershed. Next slide, please. And if you can do it once then to give kind of a good status assessment, then doing trend monitoring also becomes a lot easier. Basically, you just have to go back and repeat sample some of those sites again at a future point in time, and then the difference between those is basically your trend assessment or how things are changing through time. Next slide, please. And so to really tap into kind of the next generation big data and across agency sort of perspectives that we've done in the temperature world and with some of the existing fisheries data sets, we want to kind of get out ahead of the curve here in terms of these eDNA data sets by designing a database up front so that as people collect more and more of this information, it can all be done efficiently and all agencies can share information and leverage off of what other people are doing in the part of the world that they care about most. And so that's where this Aquatic eDNAtlas project comes in now. This is something that we have funded through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And the idea is, over the course of this year to design that database, to create a website so that it's out there, and then all the data that are being collected and processed through the National Genomics Center, those will just go up online at the end of every field season so that people can have access to it and share it and use it for whatever they're interested in. And there's already something like 7,000 of these eDNA samples that have been collected and processed by the National Genomics Center. Next slide, please. In terms of the database then, there's, as I showed earlier, steps in the process of creating that for any sort of database, but these would be the ones that are specific to the Atlas database. Basically, there's a published and robust field protocol for how the samples are collected in the field, and to collect the samples in, it's easy to do. The National Genomics Center actually just mails all the equipment that a person needs to collect the sample to them. They collect it following the protocol. It goes back to the lab where, again, there's a standard set of QA/QC procedures for how the information is processed. And then they pass that information to us in the standardized file formats that we've developed, and that makes it efficient to put it right into the relational and geospatial databases, and then we do the metadata documentation to make it easy for people to understand and see what exactly that database consists of. Next slide, please. And then one of the questions that comes up increasingly then with these sorts of large databases, especially once you start sharing across agencies, is maybe we don't want to have our data out there. And that's where, again, having it organized in a good database makes it possible to filter the database so that information that people don't want displayed on a public website is easily to pull out and not make sure it doesn't go public. So if there are private lands issues or issues with a sensitive species that people are considering maybe petitioning for listing and it's just too early in the process for that information to be publicly available, that can all be filtered out so that it's basically only information that someone who collected the data would have access to. Next slide, please. But for the data that people do agree to share, and our experience in doing this oftentimes has been that the vast majority of data that people contribute to these projects they are willing to share, then it's easy to port that information into online databases once we get that database structure figured out on the front end. And so this project is just another one that we have with these eDNA databases, and it focuses on bull trout. And just an example then of kind of this full information cycle working. This last summer, working with a couple dozen different agencies and interested groups across the Northwest, we helped coordinate the sampling of 3,000 stream sites for bull trout. This next summer, 2017, we'll sample in coordination with those groups another 4,000 sites. And by the end of this project, then we'll have sampled something like 10,000 sites within the range of bull trout, targeting those specifically at places where people were uncertain as to whether or not that ESA listed species occurs. And because it's already in a database structure from day one, next slide please, that allows us to port it into a data portal online using ArcGIS Online so that people can see the entire range of the species. As they zoom in, then it provides additional information about the sampling grid, and then a person can actually download all the data or just draw a box around subsets of the data and download it in shapefiles and other files, structures that are easy to use. Next slide, please. And I think that there's just a tremendous amount of power in terms of now linking up these new technologies with these databases and working across agencies really to build these things collaboratively. Climate change is kind of something that really drove us to develop this sort of a science technology model, and we found really for it just to be beneficial to everyone to create some additional links in that chain where we're using the data sets that are collected by the people on the landscape that have to ultimately make the decision, and research is just helping provide them better information and more usability out of the data sets that they're already collecting. Next slide, please. And then climate change is kind of one of the big things that are driving this, but any time that we can develop more robust databases and information that flows from those databases, then that's also going to help us address many of the bread and butter issues that we have with regards to habitat impairments or urbanization and population growth, and how and where do we invest our limited resources most efficiently to have the biggest bang for the buck. And just better information, next slide please, is always going to let us do that. And in many cases, not only can we do more with less, but maybe we can do a whole lot more just by getting these data sets we already have organized into functional databases. And that's all I've got. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. We really appreciate that terrific presentation. We do have a number of questions that have come in already, and so I'm going to read through those and just remind everyone that if you do have questions for Dan, since we do have the lines muted at the moment, please type them in the chat box, which you'll find in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. So Dan, the first question is from Lindsay Wise. It's, how do you handle new data coming in? Do you have to repeatedly field map and QC incoming data, or are your partners providing you with new data in a compatible format?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the database that we're talking about. That certainly having it formatted in an agreed upon format from the partners early in the process is really the way to go in terms of efficiency. And so that's literally where we are now with the eDNA databases. It's all got to come into them in a certain format, and they pass it to us in a certain format. But some of the earlier databases, say with the stream temperature data sets, those had been collected for so long, over so many years, in so many different ways that we really had to just kind of take it upon ourselves to clean it all up and get it organized. And so that isn't as efficient now as the system we have set up for doing kind of these next generation databases. So it's really a mix, but the more standardized you can force everyone to be, then the more efficient it all can be in terms of that information flow.
Great, thank you. Follow-up question, how big is your team? How many people work on managing the database, the website? Do you provide training? What's your division of labor look like?
Again, it kind of depends on the specific database, but here in Boise, where we've kind of got our core staff, I guess there's 5 of us. We've got one person who is a GIS expert, one person does the relational databases, so things like Access and Oracle, one person who's a web designer and maintains the websites and works with the scientists to design them. And then kind of depending on the database or data sets you're dealing with, then your database team, the people that are actually focusing on organizing messy or disparate data sets into a database structure that the relational database person can handle. The size of that data team really varies. We've usually got one kind of mid-level person that does some of that, but then we can hire seasonal technicians or some of the things with these temperature data sets is they're so large, there's so many records there, and it's really monotonous work. So we can get by with having summer technicians come in and do some of that. But you probably need a core 3 or 4 people that all have complementary skill sets really to build one of these functional teams.
Great, thank you, Dan. Question from Troy Osborne: is it possible to use tools such as Citrix ArcMap to link to data from other state agencies in order to do this type of data analysis and data research?
That's a good question, and I unfortunately don't know enough about the specifics of some of those different data platforms to know, whether that would be possible with regards to something like Citrix. I would have to have either my geospatial person or my relational database person here to answer that sort of thing. One thing I do know that has us really excited about ARC Online is that once the data sets are to the point where you can be porting that information dynamically to a web server, it then does become possible to create synthetic data sets online where you're pulling from other databases if that compatibility is there. And so Forest Service has moved in a big way to this ARC Online platform, and we're going to try to migrate some of our previous databases into the same sort of ARC Online tool as we have now for eDNA. And once we can do that, then we can be merging our climate scenarios, our flow scenarios, the biological data sets seamlessly in dynamic online sessions. So it really comes down to the intercompatibility of the different database platforms.
Great, thank you, Dan. We have 2 questions here, which I'll combine into one from Lindsay Wise and one from Teresa Davidson. Lindsay asks, is it possible to expand into and partner with Canada? And following on to that, Teresa Davidson says, can this be done in any other part of the country? And are other Forest Service research stations doing similar same types of work?
Let's see. I guess there's multi-parts there. I guess everything ultimately is possible to do in other parts of the country or Canada. It literally does kind of come down to the technical skill sets of the people in those different geographic areas, how fast they can get up and running with some of these things. We're working, we've actually got one project with some Canadian collaborators in British Columbia. We're in there, they're trying to essentially replicate what we've done for the Norwest Stream Temperature Project in British Columbia. And so we've been working with their technical team to help them develop protocols that are specific to the stream hydrography data set that they've got for Canada, which is unfortunately different than the national hydrography data set that we have in the U.S. And so you've got to have a kind of a different protocol once you're north of the border. But what we're working towards being able to do that in the eastern U.S., certainly the Forest Service is interested in having this similar level of capability across all the forests within the forest system, and we're kind of in the process now of talking through how that might be done, whether there's another team that gets spun up in the eastern U.S. or whether we just try to expand the geographic scope of some of the existing projects that we've done. I think one thing that we're going to probably do with the eDNA data sets, because those now are set up to be very efficient and don't necessarily require a lot of on-the-ground digital work before you collect the data and have it go into a database, is potentially expanding that Atlas project to the eastern U.S. So we'll get it set up and working for the western U.S. this year, and then if there's partner support for it, we'll go back to National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and say, hey, let's just replicate it for the eastern U.S. so that everyone there can also be working with the National Genomics Center and getting their information out of those data sets as efficiently as possible.
Great, thank you. A question here from Joanne Dullum. Very practical question. I would be interested in participating in trainings to build my data mining skills to be able to work in interagency toolboxes in the U.S. I'm interested in the various trainings you mentioned, R, Oracle, SQL, etc. I've tried online courses in data science, but have not found these to be specific enough for what I need. Is there anyone heading the charge to develop this kind of training using interagency data?
Yeah, I guess I don't have a good answer to that. The technical skills to be able to deal with these large data sets, I think some of the online training and other courses that are available are the foundations of what a person would need. And then, the interagency part of it, that I think comes from, really having partnerships between groups that are working together to start sharing data and committing resources to building the database team that's going to do that for them if it doesn't already exist.
Great, thank you. A question from Sandy Boyce in the Forest Service. You mentioned that for bull trout you had 348 quality sites. Have you taken the next step to identify sites where you might be able to focus funds in order to improve habitats?
Yes and no. So as part of that Climate Shield project and building maps for all the bull trout habitats across their range and then making them available to people, what we're trying to do really is give the land managers that are out there having to make those decisions about where they're going to try to do road restorations or culvert removals or repairing improvements, give them the information that they need to look at that stream and go, yeah, this is a really high quality potential habitat for bull trout. I should be directing my resources locally to that place or not. If it's a place that has a low probability in the future of supporting bull trout as it warms up, and so maybe I don't want to allocate conservation resources there. But that level of using the information really is beyond what we do kind of in the research branch. We're just trying to give folks on the ground that are already making those decisions all the time information that they need to be able to do that strategically.
Great, thank you. Question here from Ann Tim. How did you choose which partners to include when you were first developing the first version of the large-scale database, and how did you go about engaging them in the process?
Yeah. Now, that's a great question. So the partners, well, I guess there's two levels of partners. There's the collaborating partners on the science team, and then there's the partners that provide data to the database that the science team can work with. And so the first part of that, the science team kind of just grew organically out of a series of research projects we'd done, papers that we'd published, and we kind of knew who had the specific technical skill sets to run the models or to provide the climate scenarios that we would need. And so we basically wrote a grant to the Great Northern LCC to say we've got the skills to build this big database and create these climate scenarios using this set of collaborators that came from USGS and Australia and NOAA and Forest Service. And then there's the set of partners that are contributing data to it, and those partners then were engaged literally via email and a lot of going to meetings and talking about the possibilities and just saying we will organize your messy data sets for you if you're willing to take a few minutes and send us the files, is what it came down to. And then I had done a Climate Aquatics blog for several years where I had just developed a big email list for folks across the country, and I just started carving out chunks of that and sending it to people in specific river basins to say, hey, we're going to work in your place next. Will you mind sending us the data over the next few months? Get us everything you can, and that will go into the database. And so that's kind of how we did the direct email approach to people to engage them. And then having the website up. Once you have the website up and once you can show the data products that you've created in one river basin and say, hey, you're going to have the same thing here in terms of an easy-to-use database and these interpolated map scenarios, if you give us your data, then that really helped kind of the whole project pick up speed, because people could then start to see tangibly what they would get out of it if they spent a little time organizing it and sending us their data.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. One final question here from Sandy Boyce again. Given climate change futures, have you developed a year-by-year trend analysis to show which reaches of habitat become unsuitable decades into the future?
Yes, in various forms. So, one of the things that you can do now, because we've got something like 36 different historical and future scenarios online, is you can just compare, current conditions to future conditions from those maps, subtract one from the other, and then that can highlight for you places that are passing a certain temperature threshold. And then if you know enough about the ecology of the species that you're interested in, you can tie that temperature exceedance back to the ecology of bull trout or cutthroat trout or modeled sculpin and say, yeah, this is a place that's likely to become too warm in the future. The challenge then in terms of really going that final step to giving people the information they need to prioritize would be to also have a really high resolution layer that shows habitat impairments, so that you could say, well, this is a place that's going to go beyond that threshold, and it's, say, within a wilderness area. So probably the riparian condition, other things there are functioning at capacity. There's not a whole lot we can do, as opposed to, here's a place that's managed and the riparian zone is really degraded. Maybe there we go in and restore it, and we can keep that habitat from going beyond that threshold for that particular species. So that can be done at some level, but there's also additional information that is needed really to operationalize that for people on the landscape.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you for a terrific presentation and for taking the time to answer all these questions. We've reached the end of our hour, folks, and so I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. And here to give us a few last-minute remarks, I'm going to unmute the line, and Monica Thomas.
The conference has been unmuted.
Will offer some final closing remarks for us. Monica.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Thank you very much, Dan. It was very eye-opening and really impressive. So for everyone listening, if you have a particular wildlife or natural resource topic of interest that you'd like us to cover, please send your request to Jonathan. Our next webinar will be on the research to understand the mule deer population decline. And this webinar is going to describe a collaborative project between Forest Service Research and Development and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. It'll be Mike Wisdom and Darren Clark on April 3rd. That's mule deer population decline. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all very much. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.